The science is clear. Collagen is the most abundant protein in your body, essential for healthy skin, joints, bones, and even gut health. But starting in our mid 20s, our collagen production begins to decline. And by age 40, most people have lost significant collagen, leading to wrinkles, joint discomfort, and slower recovery. That's why I'm excited to announce the latest product I formulated for my supplement line, Adapt Naturals. BioAvail Collagen Plus contains Solugel certified grass-fed collagen peptides, with the only truly certified grass-fed collagen ingredient on the market. Unlike competitors who make unverified grass-fed claims, our collagen is certified by LIAF Control in collaboration with the American Grass-Fed Association. BioAvail Collagen Plus contains low molecular weight peptides in the 2 kilodalton range, making it more bioavailable, easier to digest, and dissolve completely clear in liquids. Each serving delivers the research-backed dose of 10 grams of collagen peptides to support skin elasticity, joint comfort, muscle recovery, and gut health. Visit adaptnaturals.com to learn more about BioAvail Collagen Plus and take a proactive step toward looking and feeling your best at any age. Hey everybody, Chris Kresser here. Welcome to another episode of Revolution Health Radio. This week, we are going to revisit the topic of indoor air quality. If you've been listening to my show for any length of time, you know that this is something I pay a lot of attention to. I've struggled with mold-related illness myself. I've had mold issues in three out of the 3 homes that we've owned. Water damage in 2 cases and just high relative humidity in another case. I ended up specializing in treating people with mold illness and other illnesses related to indoor air quality in my clinical practice. That was one of the things that I focused on. And if you've been a longtime listener, you have heard many guests on my show talking about this, both from the, testing indoor air quality and remediating perspective, and also from the, clinical perspective. And this week we have a new guest who has not been on the show yet. His name is Michael Rubino. He's an indoor air quality expert, environmental wellness advocate, and he is really passionate about this topic. He founded a nonprofit that's dedicated to educating people about the importance of indoor air quality and also how to properly vet indoor environmental professionals to do that, the proper kinds of testing. He has a company that does testing under the Home Cleanse brand. He's written a book on air quality, and he just has a wealth of experience in this world. So we talked about how to even know whether you have an indoor air quality issue, and that might be contributing to your symptoms, how to do some kind of basic DIY testing at home, maybe before you involve a professional, why it often is really important to involve a professional and how to choose one who's actually qualified. There definitely are a lot of people who are not, who are representing themselves as mold experts in this space. Some key tips on remediation, other indoor air toxins besides mold that we're not paying enough attention to often. And yeah, there was just a really wide-ranging conversation on this topic. And I think it's really important for everyone to understand this because we spend a lot of our time indoors, most of us, at the very least, if you're sleeping for hopefully, 7 or 8 hours inside. And for many of us, it's, we're spending much more than that indoors. So I got a lot out of this interview. I think you will too. Let's dive in. Michael, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
So air quality is something I've written and talked a lot about over many years. I've had personal experience with mold in my home a couple of different times, and as a functional medicine clinician, worked with a lot of patients with mold-related illness, chronic inflammatory response syndrome, and I think indoor air quality is a really neglected and important area of health, especially given the amount of time that most of us are spending indoors these days. So how did you get interested in this topic, and why is it so important, especially now?
Yeah, and it's way too common, as you can see, and as we all have kind of dealt with, and we see more on social media these days. It's like everybody is dealing with this, no matter where you turn. I got into this industry actually about a little over 12 years ago now. My dad's been a restoration contractor since I'm 5 years old, so I've been around construction my entire life. He typically did fire restoration, but if you know anything about fires, they get put out with water. If you know anything about mold, mold likes water, right? So uh, really, in consequence, I guess just being around fire restoration too and seeing all the different hazards that come with that, plus the mold aspect, it's obviously something that I kind of grew up around. However, I'll be honest, I didn't really understand fully the health effects of this until after Hurricane Sandy happened. So I'm originally from the Northeast. And it was right after college, Hurricane Sandy happens. I moved back home. I'm, working for my dad and what I thought would be a transitional type of career move here. And as I started to see a pattern of people getting sick from their own homes and really starting to connect the dots from, oh my goodness, the air we breathe can affect our health. That's when I really started to become passionate about this work. As I saw, a pretty big need for remediation from a health perspective.
Nice. And you have focused a little more in an area that I have not thought so much about, and I don't hear as much about in the indoor air quality world, which is dust. So why are you concerned about dust, and why should we be concerned about dust?
It's so interesting. One of the big challenges that I had with what I did for a living and with respects to remediation was, you have to figure out, does a house have a problem, right? That's the first question you have to ask. Does the house have a problem? And most people, to answer that question, they call an inspector, right? An inspector comes in, and what do they usually do? They take these air samples, right? And the problem with air samples is it's a really great tool for targeting. If you suspect mold might be behind this wall behind me, right? For example, testing really close to that wall will give you a pretty good idea if there's something going on in the vicinity of it, right? But if I actually test further away, like the center of the room, I might miss entirely what's going on behind this wall, right? And so what we see is that an air test is a really good tool for a snapshot in time in the location that it's in, right? And so many people, they hire these inspectors, they take these air samples, and unfortunately, they don't find anything. And that can give you a false sense of security because you might think, okay, it's not my house anymore. Let me look at other things. And that was happening way too often, right? And so, where does the dust play into this? Well, anything that is in your environment, right? Because of gravity itself, anything that goes into the air, what goes up must come down, right? And so, if you actually test your dust, you will find all kinds of things in your dust, like bacteria and microplastics and mold and even virus particles and formaldehyde and you name it, right? And so, why is that important? Because the dust and actually looking at the dust is a better screening tool. And that's why I kind of went in that direction. And so I fully, love the technology that comes with testing your dust. Now, here's the other thing too. Whatever's in your dust is in your body, right? So I want you to think about the times that you sat near a window on a sunny day and you saw that ray of light refract off the dust and you're like, wow, man, my air is dusty, right? And so if your air is dusty, obviously your lungs are going to be dusty too because you're going to be breathing that in. Unfortunately, it's one of those inconsequential things that happens in our
Right, and
homes.
then there's some mold spores like Stachybotrys that are heavier than others, right, and will tend to settle more
Yes,
in the dust and be harder to find in an air sample, and so
correct.
that can also provide a false sense of security if you're not finding them in this little globe size area of air that you're testing in
Exactly.
the room. And so are you using ERMI and hurts me too as a way of screening of assessing the dust levels, or do you use other methodologies?
So I developed a product called the Dust Test, but it just so you're aware, full disclosure, it essentially is the same thing as an ERMI. It just doesn't have the score that the ERMI has. And for those that may not know, the ERMI itself, it stands for the Environmental Relative Moldiness Index. That is the scoring algorithm that was developed by the EPA. But the technology that ERMI kind of sits on top of is called MSQ PCR. And so I love the technology itself. The scoring can be a bit confusing if you don't know how to interpret it properly. Unfortunately for consumers, a lot of consumers, they go and order these tests, and then they get more questions than answers when they actually get the results. So we wanted to kind of make the data make more sense to people and make it easier for people to comprehend and actually to put into action. But yeah, it's essentially MSQ PCR technology.
Right. And for those not familiar, that's a quantitative assay that's looking at the actual, levels of each thing that it's testing for. So you get a really precise analysis of what you're seeing in the dust. So you've talked a lot about clean breathing, and I imagine this is related to what we just talked about, the dust and things that are in your home you're going to be inhaling, and many of them are of course invisible, so we don't know that that's happening. What do you mean by clean breathing?
Yeah, good. Clean breathing is making a conscientious effort to reduce the amount of particles that you're breathing in every day, right? And that's the key word, is conscientious effort. And I think a lot of people, don't make a conscientious effort. And I think creating that awareness is really important, because all it takes is, frequent cleaning to remove our dust reservoirs that are building up in our environment. It takes thinking about, things like air purifiers and making sure we have them, opening windows when appropriate and the outdoor air quality is good and the humidity is not too high. And honestly, just improving our ventilation inside of our homes. I mean, one of the big challenges that we've really experienced societally is that we have a huge push towards energy efficiency, right? And one of the inconsequential disadvantages of this energy efficiency push is the fact that our homes are typically tighter and tighter, meaning there's a less volume of air exchange from indoor to outdoors. And so what ends up happening is everything inside that we're living with, right, ends up becoming you're increasing the amount of particles that you're actually inhaling as a result, right? Because a lot of those particles would otherwise escape in these older homes that are much more ventilated. And so, again, it's not to freak people out, but it's one of those things you want to be thinking about.
For sure. And when did that change really gain steam in terms of home building? Just so people are listening to this, they're like, okay, I bought my home in 1990. Am I safe? Or versus like I bought my home in 2015 or 2020. Like when was the cutoff when that really started to change?
Well, the rumbling started to happen in the 70s when Richard Nixon was president. We're dealing with an energy crisis
Yeah,
globally, but really it started to really accelerate, in the 2000s and really the 2010s. And so that it's really the much newer homes in the last 10, 15 years that are going to be much, much tighter. And you can see that they progressively get tighter, from the 70s on. But homes in the 80s and 90s, they're still breathing much, much better. They're still ventilated much, much better than the brand new homes that are being built today.
yeah. How do you tell if someone's wondering, like, is my home too tight? Do I need to think about like an HRV, which I'll ask you about in a
Yeah.
moment, or ways for improving ventilation? How do you assess that? Is there a way for a homeowner to assess that without a professional, or is that something that has to be done professionally?
Yeah, I mean, unless you've ever done a blower door test, you're probably going to want a professional, because those are tests that need to be done accurately. Otherwise, the data behind it is pretty useless. But you basically want to do either a blower door test or or something called an energy audit, where they can actually understand how much pressure change is happening between outside and inside. And if it's too tight, you already mentioned it, we can do something like an HRV or an ERV, right? Some level of bringing in mechanical, ventilation mechanically would be all we need to do to kind of course correct. It's just the issue is none of us are aware of it. It's not terribly expensive, for a few $1,000s, you can really start to bring in fresh air. It's just that a lot of us don't know about it, right? And so if an ERV, HRV, or just a mechanical ventilation system hasn't been part of your construction plan, you might not have it and have no idea.
Yeah. Can you explain for people who are not familiar with ERVs and HRVs what they are, what the difference between an ERV and HRV is, and how this kind of addresses the problem?
Yeah.
I'm quite familiar with them from my my work, and I think we've talked about them once or twice on the show, but it'd be a good refresher for new listeners.
Yeah, they're an energy recovery ventilator. To kind of give people a layman's term of what they really are is they bring fresh air in, and then they take the air that's already in and exhaust it out, right? And so it is bringing that, literally just exchanging the air from inside to outside. And the difference between ERV and HRV is essentially some of them, have exchangers where they're literally exchange the temperature of the air as the air passes through. And so, depending on the climate you're in, depending on the situation you're in, you may want an HRV as opposed to an ERV. But essentially, the idea is to do the exact same thing, is to exchange the stale air inside with the fresh air from outside, and to do it in a safe and effective manner.
Great. Yeah. So I have one of these, and we use it just to for the listeners. They're pretty easy to work with. You can set different time how much fresh air venting you want. You can change it at different times of year. If in the winter you bring in cold air, and that's where the HRV is helpful, right? Because you can actually
Yeah.
heat that cold air. So it depends on what climate you live in and what you might want to need, what you might need there. Let's talk a little bit about where to start, because I found in my clinical practice this was one of the biggest issues for people. They will hear a podcast like this, or hear from a friend like, well, I don't know if I have how do I know if I have a problem? I do have symptoms. I don't know if my symptoms are related to indoor air quality. But let's make it a little easier. Let's imagine a hypothetical scenario, one that I saw pretty frequently in my practice, which was like, let's say somebody has noticed that they feel worse in their house than they do when they're away from their house or on a vacation. A pretty common one was somebody who sleeps a lot better outside of their home versus when they're in their bedroom, which you would kind of think would be the opposite for most people. They sleep worse in hotels and all of that. So if somebody is sleeping a lot better when they're not in their bedroom, that was for me always a kind of a red flag of like, maybe there's something going on here. What should that person do? Obviously, the best solution is to find someone like you or an indoor environmental professional to come and help. But even before that, what are some what's the in medicine we call it a differential diagnosis? Like how do you start to sort of narrow down the possibilities or do some initial kind of testing at home before you bring in the professionals to determine whether your indoor air quality is even contributing to your symptoms in the first place?
Yeah, and look, and that's exactly why I created this product called the dust test, because it's literally this at-home test. We already talked about a comparative test too. If you want another opinion, called the ERMI, right? Where you could buy those tests, collect dust from across your house. It's super simple. You can do one and screen your entire home with one. You can do a few, and kind of break your home into sections so you can get some comparative analysis of what might be going on in, let's just say, a quadrant of the home. So you have a couple of different options, but kind of this allows you to kind of be in the driver's seat and really start to understand your environment a little bit. So you're not necessarily relying on a professional to tell you, okay, do I have a problem or not? And that typically is going to be a more cost-effective way anyway of just answering the question, do I have a problem? Now, where is the problem? That gets a little more nuanced, and we'll go into that in a second. But if you just want to know where to start, I would start there, to be honest, because I think that's what it is designed for. It's a screening tool. What's
Yeah.
really interesting about that too is, depending on the camp that you're in medically, right? You have different mycotoxin testing. I found really, really interesting. I find a lot of correlation. I'm not going to say causation. I'm just going to say I find a lot of correlation between certain molds in people's homes via the dust test and ERMIs. And interestingly enough, some of the mycotoxins they might have elevated. And there's mycotoxin testing has come a long way too. They've got the IgG and IgE ones you can do. I don't know which tests you necessarily co-sponsor, but I'm just giving people the lay of the land of what's out
Yeah.
there, right?
Yeah.
And so it's really interesting how you can kind of start there, and start to draw some conclusions, and then you also want to couple different things to take into consideration. Yeah. Do I feel better when I'm not at home? Do I feel better when I'm sleeping somewhere else? You pair that with the information looking at the geometric means. How high are some of these molds compared to the geometric means? And that can start to, give you some clues as to, hey, maybe there is something at my house worth exploring. And that can give you the confidence you need to kind of take that next step, which would be, figure out where the problems are coming from.
Right. Yeah, there's also a couple of other things if you're able to do this, which would be like sleep in another bedroom in your house. And if you sleep better in that other bedroom, perhaps there's something in your bedroom that's more specific. I mean, obviously mold, if it's mold, and most other airborne stuff can communicate through the house and through closed doors. But sometimes if the source is in a particular location, it'll be worse, closer to that source. And there's small things like that you can do to try to isolate the problem and figure it out. But then it sounds like ERMI is maybe the next step. And then if there's some positive signal, or not ERMI, but the MSQ PCR, whether you're using ERMI scoring or not, then if there's some signal there, then you generally want to keep going, right? And do more specific testing and then start trying to identify the source of where those things are coming from.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head, right? The closer you are to the source, it's no secret, the more particles you're going to be breathing in, right? And what are those particles we'd be concerned about with mold? You have MVOCs, you have the particles and spores and fragments themselves. You've got, of course, the potential for mycotoxins too, depending on the type of mold, right? And so you look at all three of those things, which have been studied and known to have their own sort of, health risks. You want to take all that into consideration. And look, just to close the loop on mold a little bit, no one's going to have a mold free home. You're always going to have some level of mold, right? You just don't want to have mold growing out of control. And that's, when all these horror stories that you hear about where people are getting sick, it's unfortunate, but the reality of the situation is mold grew out of control, and so I always want to say that because we don't want to be scared of mold. We don't want to build bubbles around our houses. We're going to have some mold. It's okay. We just want to have it under control. And that's really the big key here is. And so when you're doing testing and investigating, you're trying to figure out what's happening with the house and why is there water coming in somewhere? It could be hidden, right? But where is it growing out of control? And that's where we want to look at where the source is, eradicating that source through proper and safe remediation, and then cleaning up the byproducts. That's where the HVAC comes into play, and removing household dust that's been accumulating these particles and toxins over time. And that's how you really start to kind of move that needle, reduce the burden of particles and toxins that you might be breathing in consistently 20,000 times per day. And then lo and behold, usually people notice the difference.
Yeah. And it seems like people should know this, that because I've often heard from just, like friends of friends or whatever, they know I'm in this field and they know I know something about this, and they'll order a qPCR test online, or, and then they'll just do a sample in a room and it will have some mold. As you said, inevitably it will have some mold. Like
Sure.
that, and they'll start freaking out and be like, "Oh my God, I have mold! I have mold!" And I often tell them, well, we need some kind of control here. Like, what are the levels elsewhere, outside? What you need to be able to compare so that you're not just looking at something in isolation. Is that how you approach it, with a outdoor control sample, or what do you typically recommend to make sure that we're not chasing red herrings?
Yeah. So, I mean, usually you always want to have some level of control sample to compare it to. I was just at Series X actually this past weekend, and I was listening to some of the talks, and there's some guys doing, ERMI samples as controls outside. And they're literally like, there'll be a stop sign right near the corner of the house. They'll collect some dust off the stop sign. They'll send that in, and then they'll take a couple different ERMI samples throughout, different quadrants of the house. And I was getting to look at the data. They were showing it as a case study, and it's really a smart idea, because we understand two different things. One, mold is part of our ecosystem, so it's part of our universe. We have to live with it. What we have outside is normal occurrence that we're going to have inside of our homes, right? Obviously, you're going to have less because you've got barriers like walls and windows and things that do keep things out. But no house is hermetically sealed. Even the super new tight ones, they have some air exchange, right? So you're always going to have some migration from outside to inside. So you want to look at that. You want to have some comparative analysis, and it's interesting because you don't really see a lot from the industry itself. You don't really see a lot of people talking about, hey, do an outside control sample using the qPCR. You normally only see that with air testing, but I do want to say that the industry is shifting. The industry that does believe in qPCR, there's a whole nother topic of conversation on some people don't even believe that technology is useful, but
Yeah.
that's we could talk
I'm
about that
familiar with
after.
that debate. I've been through
Yeah.
that many times. So,
It's DNA specific technology. It's validated in court. So
yeah.
what else do you need? But at the end of the day, doing that outside control sample, I think, could be very valuable because you want to understand what are the molds that are elevated outside in the vicinity of my house that we know are going to be elevated inside my house no matter what. And I think having that comparative analysis is really brilliant. And I think that I'm really happy to see the industry moving in that direction. And I think if you're listening to this and you ordered an ERMI, order two. Do one
Yeah.
outside, do one inside. It's going to provide you some peace of mind for some things that, numbers that might seem scary, but now you understand, okay, this is just normal trappings coming in from outside.
Collagen isn't just about beauty, it's the structural protein that literally holds your body together. It makes up about 30% of all the protein in your body, supporting everything from your skin and joints to your gut lining and blood vessels. That's why I'm thrilled to announce the latest product I formulated for my supplement line, Adapt Naturals. BioVale Collagen Plus is a premium collagen supplement that stands apart in three crucial ways. First, it contains the only truly certified grass fed collagen ingredient on the market. While most brands make unverified grass fed claims, our Solugel collagen peptides are certified by LIAF Control in collaboration with the American Grass Fed Association. This certification guarantees our collagen comes from cattle raised outdoors on pasture 365 days per year without hormones, antibiotics, or steroids. It also ensures the animals are born and raised on family farms and ranches rather than big multinational corporate operations. Second, it has an optimal molecular weight of 2 kilodaltons, which is critical for absorption. This low molecular weight means it dissolves completely clearly in liquids, is rapidly absorbed, and is gentle on your digestive system, avoiding the bloating some people experience with other collagen supplements. Third, each serving delivers the full 10-gram dose shown in clinical studies to deliver real results, from improved skin elasticity and reduced wrinkles to better joint comfort and faster exercise recovery. And unlike other supplements that contain fillers or additives, BioVale Collagen Plus contains just one clean ingredient, certified grass-fed collagen peptides, nothing else. Visit adaptnaturals.com to learn more about BioVale Collagen Plus and experience the difference that truly pure, optimally formulated collagen can make for your skin, joints, and overall health. So let's talk about some other contaminants. There's a lot of focus on mold, appropriately so. A lot of homes are moldy, unfortunately.
Yeah.
This is just a reality that I've come to terms with over many years of treating patients. And 2 out of the 3 homes that we've owned have had a significant mold issue. Actually, 3. We recently in our current house, we remodeled the master bathroom, and a couple months after that, I was in the living room just reading a book, and then I looked up at the ceiling and saw the very
Uh,
telltale warping bubbles in the drywall, and the plumbers who had done the installation of the tub in the master bathroom had you know whether or not it was their fault or the faulty pipe, which is what they said, the pipe broke and there was just water accumulating there. So
yeah.
it's all too common, right? Like
It's
stuff
all
like
too
that
common.
happens all the time. There's water damage that happens. There's even just in one of our homes, mold was just forming because the relative humidity where we lived was quite high. And so, a bookcase that's touching a wall, you can get mold forming
Totally.
in that situation. So important for sure. And I've talked a lot about that on this show, but I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the other contaminants like formaldehyde and VOCs, like things you might encounter in new home construction, or even just from cooking, off gassing, chemicals that are formed when you're cooking food at high temperatures, and even carbon dioxide. You talked earlier about how tightly sealed our homes have become, and I have seen some reports of people finding that the CO2 levels in their bedroom were actually quite high when they measured them, and that was maybe causing some insomnia and sleep issues because they were not the CO2 at high levels is not good for us. So just curious, like if you reflect on your time spent doing all of this and you had to sort of force rank those things I just mentioned in terms of how common they are in terms of causing people's symptoms, how would you do that?
Ooh, that would be a tough question to answer. And I would say that mostly because it would probably be an unfair answer, only because I think that most of the time formaldehyde doesn't get
Very
looked at.
interesting. Hmm.
If someone finds mold, for example, or high levels of bacteria, you typically start to go right into the water damage scenarios. You start to dive right into that, and a lot of those things get checked then only if by addressing everything else you still didn't solve the problem and there's still something ongoing. Like I'll give you an example. I was on a project once. The project had a lot of water damage. Okay, needed mold remediation. There was a lot of work that was done there. There was presence of mycotoxins that were tested in the dust in this house. Whole place needed to be cleaned. That all got cleaned up. Client walks back in. I think it was like the next day or so, and immediately just headaches, not feeling well. It was like the mold's still here. I could tell. And we had third party testing come in. There was definitely no mold at that point. The mycotoxins all came back into normal ranges. But actually, we ended up getting like an HVAC specialist over there, and the HVAC specialist found that the exhaust of the HVAC was installed by like a family friend of the client. We later found out, but it was installed too close to the gas exhaust was installed too close to the intake. And so what ended up happening is literally carbon monoxide was getting drawn back into the house, back into the HVAC system, and then dispersed throughout the house.
Yikes.
Luckily, the levels were really low, or I probably wouldn't be here today, and so
Yeah.
many other
Yeah.
people wouldn't be here today, including the
Hmm.
clients. But they were high enough to cause symptoms, right? And so, thankfully, she did get rid of the mold, and that was important, and she probably had some issues with that, in and of itself. But we also found that there was a carbon monoxide issue, right? And so I think the point is, unfortunately, especially in my field, um, people are very myopic on the water damage side, and everybody starts there and kind of works their way backwards as needed. But that doesn't negate the fact that we have real issues with VOCs. And it's kind of like, when we ban BPA, right? We just come out with BPB, right? So there are VOCs out there that are classified as zero VOC by the EPA that we're finding out are harmful today, right? And so, we've definitely got an issue with VOCs. Not every material is required to be low VOC or zero VOC anyway. So that means that there are some paints that have tons of VOCs, right? There are epoxy coatings that get used all the time that off gas tons of VOCs, and it's okay if you're aware of it and you know to ventilate the space and you're controlling it and you're not exposing yourself to it too much. It's just that it's one of those things that people aren't always aware of. Now, for VOCs, for those that don't know, VOCs, they stand for volatile organic compounds. They're essentially particles that off gas from a product as it's curing or drying, right? But a lot of what we bring into our house these days, especially with the lovely invention of Amazon, where we just get anything we want in a cardboard box, the VOCs is a real issue. Microplastics, a lot of it comes from our clothes themselves, but we're shedding microplastics in our environment. I saw a study recently. It was the average person, I think it was like 4 credit cards a month of plastic they
Yeah.
consume.
It's crazy.
Crazy, right? I mean, so, these are things that, how are we consuming them? Well, mostly through our skin and by breathing them in, because they're shedding from our clothes, and, we're wearing our clothes, we're moving around, things are entering through our skin, and for sure, definitely we're breathing them in, right? And so I think that's a real issue. Formaldehyde's a real issue. We were seeing, I don't know if you remember years ago, it was like the lumber liquidators or something. It was like
Yeah.
off the charts levels in flooring that people were putting in their homes. Formaldehyde, unfortunately, it's in a lot of our insulation and building materials. It's just, if you're not aware of it and you don't know to ask for formaldehyde free versions, which, by the way, usually cost more money. Unfortunately, those things go into your house. And when you think about like formaldehyde in your floor, that's a real concern for me, because there are two things that I think make a huge difference: your flooring, because there's so much of it, and your painting, because again, there's so much of it, right? And so whatever you paint on your walls, you are going to be breathing in, right? And so if you have, super high VOC paints, I don't want to name any brands, but most of the brands, unless you know to go low VOC or, zero VOC, they're going to have quite high levels of their off gassing. And just so people are aware, your walls and your floors, they could be off gassing for years, not just like days or weeks, right? And so I think that's a really important thing that people need to be more aware of. Of course, there's other, toxins that could be in adhesives and some of these other things, but again, some of those, to me, not as big of a deal. If you're worried about like adhesives in one vanity cabinet, you could really drive yourself nuts and spend a lot of money trying to make everything perfect. I would say think about the big ticket items that take up a lot of space, that are going to off gas a lot of particles. I think that's really important. And then, the other thing about water damage, I know we talk a lot about mold, is we don't talk about enough, is bacteria. I mean, look, I could promise you, if you
Hmm.
have mold, you have bacteria, right? They're going to grow in the same locations. That's why typically in our field we call it microbial growth, because it kind of covers the mold and the bacterial side. But bacteria is a real issue too, and some of the studies we're seeing on endotoxins and their effects. And endotoxins are toxins produced by certain species of bacteria that dies off. Those create a real human health risk too. And so, we want to think about all these different things in our house. Carbon dioxide, right? Just regurgitating your own carbon dioxide and not getting enough fresh oxygen. I mean, that has some real risk too. And so I think, big takeaway, if you're listening to this, is like, all right, we need more ventilation in our homes, right? And we have options. And we need to think more about what we're breathing, because we take 20,000 breaths per day. We're consuming enough air, about 2,500 gallons of air. So that's about enough air to fill up a normal sized swimming pool every single day. And the amount of particles that go with that. I mean, just think about how many particles could fit in a normal sized swimming pool. Obviously, you're not consuming, enough particles to fill a normal sized swimming pool. But you got a pretty empty glass here, and a lot of particles that are coming with that glass. So you want to be mindful of that, so you don't become the adverse effect of it.
A couple other things I want to bring up for those who live in areas where there's wildfire smoke. PM 2.5 is another consideration, and then some, like when we lived in Utah, the radon gas was another consideration as well. It's not something that affects everyone in all places, but those can be contributors to symptoms as well.
Yeah, we don't talk a lot about radon, and we need to talk more about it. It actually is a really significant issue. It's not a significant issue everywhere, as you pointed out, but these are gases that get released from the ground, and it's a real problem. A lot of people, they're aware of it when they're buying a house, right? They'll ask for, oh, do you want a radon inspection? And they're trying to figure out what that means. But it's one of those gases where if it goes goes above 4 picoliters, it's really a pretty big health risk. And I mean, there are serious consequences. Unfortunately, people have even died from having too much radon, right? And so I think it is something we want to be mindful of. I know, mold gets a lot of consideration, but I think radon does need to get talked about more too. It's not always a risk. It's easy to deal with if you have it, a lot easier sometimes than even mold, because you can install a radon mitigation system that basically just helps release those gases and pushes them up above the roof and away from the interior where your family spends the time. And so, thankfully it's something, there's something you can do about it. It's pretty reasonable. But again, it's an awareness issue. You need to know about radon. I feel like a lot of people do get to hear about it, in that home buying process. But if you've never bought a home, it's very possible you don't know about it, and you should, because even renting a place, there's some concerns there if the landlord hasn't made you aware of them.
So let's kind of wrap up the conversation on diagnosis, if you will, or talking about the various potential causes and things to look for, with some tips for people who are looking for someone to help come and do this kind of testing. So I know your company offers assessments. I don't know if if you travel and do that, so you can talk a little bit about that. But also, for some people who that's not going to be in the cards for, like, what kind of questions should they ask their local people that they talk with? Because I've been in this world for long enough to know that there's just a lot of chicanery and really shady people,
Oh yeah.
misrepresenting themselves, who really don't know what they're doing. And you can go down some really expensive and even destructive rabbit holes here if you don't really know the right questions to ask. So let's talk about that.
Without a doubt. So first off, I want to talk about there's two extremes to this coin that I think everyone should be aware of. First off, there are companies out there that are in indoor air quality that do not believe that indoor air quality is a human health risk. And so those companies, I know it's crazy, or like, how are you in air quality? You don't believe in air
Yeah.
quality, but I wish I knew, but there's like tens of thousands of those companies. Those are the companies that are looking to charge you money, do very little investigation, and provide you a report that basically says everything's fine. And that's not necessarily the option you want to go, because that's the left side of the extreme. Because now you've really done not much at all. You've just wasted money and you're no better for it. Then there's the other side of the extreme where, every single thing is a massive issue and you need to rip your house apart and gut it and start over. And look, I've done cases where houses needed to be gutted. So there are extreme situations where, the houses are very problematic. It's just that not every single house is that way, right? And so if you ever feel like you're on too extreme of a side, get a second opinion, but make sure you're getting the opinion from the right camp. Because if you're concerned about this from a health perspective, you want to actually hire somebody who actually believes this matters from a health perspective. And I think that's really, really important. Now, even in that one camp, you're going to get varying opinions, and you have to kind of decide which opinion aligns more with your goals and what you're trying to accomplish, right? Because I've had clients call me and say, "Hey, I want like hospital grade air quality. I'll spend all the money in the world. That's just what I want. This is my dream." I can make that dream a reality for you. But I'm going to tell you time and time again, at some point you are chasing a ghost, right? You are, like opening up walls for one or two spores. I never agree with that approach.
Mm-hmm.
But, I would say that it's every single house can be dealt with like a science project. You need to be in control of that science project as the homeowner to decide really what you want to do and what your goals are. And then you want to rely on these experts to answer the question fairly and honestly, to help you align the facts of the matter with the goals that you have. And it's one of those things where you literally can have a New Year's resolution tomorrow, and you could go and spend $9.99 a month and join the gym, or you could go right into, having a cold plunge and spending ten thousands of dollars on all these different amazing things and just jump all the way in, right? And so I just want to preface people with a warning that, you can really go as little or as extreme as you want on this. You're the driver, and your job is to find the right experts that are going to help you achieve your goals, right? And I know that's really interesting to say, but to be honest, that's where we are. I mean, the world is your oyster, and you can go as thorough as you'd like. Now, in terms of where do you start? How do you find people that you like? We have a nonprofit called Change the Air Foundation. You can go to changetheairfoundation.org, and we have a really amazing resource section. If you click Start Here, the first thing it's going to tell you is how do you vet an indoor environmental professional? That's the first person that comes into your home. This is the person who does the assessment, who really goes in and helps try to identify the problems. And my honest recommendation is that's the data set of things. You know, I think if you want to understand how do you be conservative on remediating your house, the best investment you can make is actually on getting the right information. Because with the right data, you can make data-driven decisions on how do you want to tackle this project actually inside your house. Because if you don't have the right data, sometimes you're swinging in the dark blind, and you start getting into that situation where you're opening more things up. You're spending more money opening things up because you're just unsure. You didn't have the data to really tell you yes or no. And so I think being data driven is actually going to save you money in the long run, on the assessment side. And then when you click that website, you go to the next section. It gives you really great questions to ask, to basically help you vet and find a remediator. Now, why do you want to vet and find a remediator? Well, because this is the person that you're going to trust to actually fix your home. And so this is where the cost side of things, this is the biggest investment out of all of it. I mean, the remediation is always going to cost more than the assessment because you're actually opening up walls. You're actually getting to the root cause of the issue. And unfortunately, the root cause of the issue, it's in the attic, it's in the HVAC, it's behind the wall, behind the ceiling. I mean, you have to cut things out to actually access typically where it's growing. And so in order to do that, there's going to be a higher ticket price than the inspection itself. And so you really want to find somebody that aligns with your goals, that's going to be as thorough as you need it to be. I mean, when I say thorough, I mean not just the actual removal part, but just helping you understand the byproducts that mold or bacteria creates over time. So you're cleaning the HVAC, you're cleaning the house, removing these dust reservoirs, and really looking at the project holistically, not just, I'm going to take a box cutter and cut out one thing and spray some chemicals, right? And so I think that part is also really important. And then to close the loop, you bring the inspector that found the problems back, and then he verifies that the remediation was successful. I hate the word successful, but it's the best word I've got, because what we need to validate that, their mold is actually gone, right? And it's been removed from the structure. And sometimes, because again, we're looking at things at 25, 50 times smaller than what the eye could see, sometimes we actually find out through that post verification that it's not all gone and more work's needed. That's why it's so important to have these checks and balances, because otherwise you end up closing everything up thinking everything's all fine, but unfortunately there's still some mold left behind, right? How does that happen, or why does that happen? Well, you may have thought, the water traveled in this section, so you cut out, let's say, 3 or 4 feet. You actually needed to go 6 feet, right? And so it's something as silly as that. But if it's not validated and verified, that you needed to go that extra 2 feet, then you're potentially leaving some mold behind, right? And so I think that's really important, to understand kind of that little process. And I call it the circle of trust. You want to, your doctor, your inspector, your remediator, everybody's all got to be on the same page. This has to be people that you trust. They have to trust each other, and everyone's got to be on the same page as to what you're doing, what's the expected outcome, and that's how you're going to know for sure that the project's done satisfactorily. You've got the best success and chance that exactly what you would hope to set out to accomplish during this project actually gets done. And I think, starting there, going to Change the Air Foundation, and just having those list of questions, because look, if everybody could hire me, of course they would. It's not practical. It's not feasible. There are 50,000 companies out there that do this. You just got to know which ones that you really need to find. You got to know how to vet them to find the right ones so you can trust them. And that's part of the process.
Absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned the retesting. I've seen a lot of people go through all of the hard work of, identifying the source and then remediating and then skipping the confirmation, which is the absolutely critical part of determining if all of the work that you did actually had the desired effect. And I get it. I mean, this stuff is expensive,
Totally.
but you absolutely need to budget for that confirmation testing. Otherwise, you don't have the peace of mind that you actually eliminated the problem.
Moreover, if you think about all of the resources that you go through between finding the problems, opening them up and remediating them properly, and then like building them back, for that extra, $1,500 or $2,500. Yeah, I don't know what the post testing costs. It obviously ranges, but it's a drop in the bucket because it's definitely the lesser of all the costs. Because even the initial inspection, they're going to take more samples typically trying to find the problems. Once you have found the problems, though, you need less samples to validate that they've been actually eradicated appropriately. And so it's kind of one of those things where I know it's expensive, but don't cut that corner. Even people with the best intentions, can fail that post test. I mean, I've failed post testing so many times. I mean, I've done thousands of projects in my career. I've had to have failed at least 100 projects. Okay. And so, I think it's really important because even though, myself or anybody out there might have the best intentions, we can't see what we can't see. I mean, these particles literally are 25 to 50 times smaller than what the eye can see. So I might look around and it might look clean, but that test tells me, you know what, we got to open up a little more. And I think that's really, really important because you never want to skip that step and then build over it and then, be right back where you started, and potentially still not feel that well as a result. And I think that then it's almost all for nothing, right? And so
Yeah,
just please don't skip that step. Super important.
absolutely. And I would say, I mean, this is a little depressing but I would say at least half the time, if not more often than not, the retest will fail just because depending on the scope of the project and what's going on, it's easy, like you said. It's not a simple task to eliminate all of the mold, and even
Yeah.
a couple of times it was just due to inadequate post cleaning. Like the source of the mold was taken care of, but
Right.
the post cleaning was not quite as rigorous as it should have been, and so it's so important to do that. And just like you said, is to have the peace of mind. You've spent all that money and time, aggravation,
Yeah.
just to know, okay, now I can cross that off the list, at least for now, and know that I have a clean environment to live in, is really, really worth the extra time and money if you can swing it.
Absolutely.
Well, Michael, thanks so much for this conversation. It's been really fascinating. And tell us how people can learn more about you. I know you have your own podcast. You've written a book. You've got a website. Like, tell people how they can learn more.
Yeah, yeah. So I wrote a book in 2020 called The Mold Medic: An Expert's Guide on Mold Removal. If you look for it, it might be very expensive currently because we've taken it offline and a new book is on the way. And so, appreciate your patience for that. But it's you might be able to find a copy here or there, and it was definitely a great book for its time, and excited to kind of update with new information and provide that to the people. And if you liked anything that I said, please go over to changetheairfoundation.org, sign up for the newsletter. We're as a nonprofit, we have three basic pillars that we look at here, and it's education and creating that education awareness so that people are better informed and make better decisions. Research, because there's a lot of research out there, but I think from an environmental side of things, there's some lacking there. So we're hoping to be able to be a beacon for people and be able to award more research. And then, of course, policy reform is the last thing. I realized pretty quickly in my career that I wasn't going to be able to solve this problem one house at a time. We really needed societal changes to prevent these types of issues from occurring because it really comes down to the way we build the homes, maintain them, restore them. There's not a lot of great protections in place for everyone. And so we actually passed our first law in Illinois this past year. In Illinois, there was no rules and regulations. There is now today, thanks to the amazing volunteers that helped us get that law passed. And, basically now they're going to have to register to become an assessor and register to become a remediator. When yesterday, prior to this law passing, you can go to sleep one day and be in pest control and wake up the next and be a mold expert. And so,
Yeah.
part of that conundrum is actually creating a bigger hole and a bigger problem across our country. And so, we're really dedicated to changing things from a societal standpoint. And so, just following our newsletter and following along and helping where you can makes a huge difference. And if you wanted to learn more about me, you can go to themichaelrubino.com. And if you wanted to learn more about, creating a healthy home, please check out homecleanse.com. And I do have a podcast called Never Been Sicker. I hope to have you on pretty soon to continue the conversation. And just really grateful to be here. And thank you so much for listening.
Great. Thank you, Michael. And thanks everyone for listening, watching the show. Please keep sending your questions to chriskresser.com/podcast question, and we'll see you next time. That's the end of this episode of Revolution Health Radio. If you appreciate the show and want to help me create a healthier and happier world, please head over to iTunes and leave us a review. They really do make a difference. If you'd like to ask a question for me to answer on a future episode, you can do that at chriskresser.com/podcast question. You can also leave a suggestion for someone you'd like me to interview there. If you're on social media, you can follow me at twitter.com/chriskresser or facebook.com/chriskresserlac. I post a lot of articles and research that I do throughout the week there that never makes it to the blog or podcast, so it's a great way to stay abreast of the latest developments. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you next time.